Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tax Stories episode number 67. And this time, my guest is Anna Gunn. Did I pronounce it well, Anna?
It's Gunn. It's
Gunn.
it's Scottish. It's a Scottish name.
All right.
Yeah,
So, sorry about that.
that's
You can
okay.
see that we haven't met before, and we don't even know each other. But Anna's profile on LinkedIn immediately caught my attention because she's a consultant specialized on tax ethics and tax
Yeah,
communication. And Anna is teaching on the same topics, the Maastricht University and University of Curacao, and is a blogger on those topics.
yes.
So that definitely is something we'll talk about later. Anna is a tax specialist also at uh, HHP Chambers,
Yes.
uh, board member at NL Fiscal, which is a tax publisher, and also a judge on tax transparency at the Association of Investors for Sustainable Development. And Anna was with a Big Four company for 8.5 years, mostly focusing on state aid law, and has studied at the universities of Cambridge and Leiden.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything important, Anna?
No, but I just to clarify, the judge, it's a judge on a prize which is awarded to companies, so not a judicial thing, but
Right,
for a
right,
prize, just to
right,
clarify.
right. Uh, let's start with the Cambridge University you studied. I saw that this was related to modern and medieval languages. Is that right? Is there a story behind this?
Of course, I'm so happy that you began there because that part is often missed out. But my first degree was indeed in modern and medieval languages at Cambridge, Jesus College. The modern and medieval languages degree is a very broad degree with a lot of space to include other disciplines. So I studied a lot of literature, obviously also translation, things to do with language, but also economics, history. So it's a very, and philosophy also. So it was quite a broad base.
Mm.
And then it was after that I studied tax law ab initio, so from the bachelor level up. So I always started the profession with a very different academic grounding than anybody else.
So
Yeah.
any medieval languages you know?
Well, we were studying. I was studying medieval Dutch, and in particular, and some German, but mostly Dutch. And we were learning about the medieval processions that people would have and the morality plays that they were doing. And I was having to write essays. And the thing about the degree and Cambridge at the time was that you had to write an essay every week. So we were studying different subjects and having to write an essay. So I was 18 and I was studying Kant, and having to write an essay on Kant basically as an 18-year-old. And that very much set for me the sort of academic bar, how I believe that teaching should be. So much. I think these days students would consider this rather arduous if they were asked to write an essay every single week. But I can assure you it can be done, and it's very good exercise.
So I can imagine then you have very broad knowledge of books that you can recommend on those topics to our listeners.
I could, if they were at all interested. Given the tax audience, I'm guessing that this maybe not is the priority for the reading list, but maybe over the Christmas period. It's you never know.
You know, I'm always interested in different sort of books. So just if you need to pick one, then for my Christmas reading.
Okay, I'll think about it, pick one, and send it to you after the show because
All right.
it's
I'll put
um,
it on the show notes. Yeah.
okay. Put
Uh,
that. That's great. Okay.
yeah.
How
Perfect.
about we put on? I know what we put on. We're going to put on Goethe's Faust. A
Oh,
German, the Faust legend, the professor who
yeah,
knows
sure.
everything and is trying to understand the world, fails, sells his soul to Mephistopheles, and then in the end is redeemed by pure love. I think this is a good segue into the rest of the interview.
Right, right. Perfect. So, and is this because the reason why you ended up living in Netherlands? This medieval Dutch language?
No, it's much more simple than that. I was born in the UK, but my parents moved to the Netherlands when I was about two, and that was it was well, it was for my father's work basically, and so I grew up in Leiden. I then moved to Cambridge for this degree, and then I simply moved back because being British. I always sort of thought that I was very English and I this was my culture and this was where I belonged. But of course, having grown up in a different country, you kind of go back to where you started, and it turns out you don't actually fit in at all. And culture is not where you're born. Culture is where you actually live and grow up. So having discovered this, I came back.
Right. Uh, let's jump to your blog for a while. The name of your blog is Article 104. Uh, eh, my understanding is that it's an article in the Dutch constitution related to
Yes.
taxation. So, is there a story behind choosing the name?
Well, it is the provision in the Constitution is that taxes shall only be levied on the basis of a law. So it's a legality principle which is enshrined in the Constitution. And I thought that was a very interesting, place to start. So I've been running the blog for about 10 years now. And I've always been thinking about all sorts of issues related to tax. And initially, it was a lot of tax and BEPS, tax and state aid, but it increasingly became about tax and ethics and all sorts of things which are surrounding law. And one time I rewrote the provision on my blog, so it said taxes are levied on the basis of law, and also all sorts of people's behaviour, ethics, the way they're taught at university. It sounded better in Dutch, but I added all sorts of other elements which I consider to be almost as important for determining law in practice as cultural and it's ethical. And hilariously, one of the students actually copy pasted it in an essay. And they ended up with this insane provision that they had in their thing, which I thought was well, it taught them to be a little more prudent as to their sources.
Mhm. And why did you start blogging, and what readers can find in your blog?
Well, I started in 2015, which is an important year. It's the year that the BEPS deliverables came out. It's around the same time that the Apple state aid investigation was started up. It's the same year that I left PwC, which is where I was working. And I was basically, I wanted to explore all of these topics and also have a voice in the public debate in Holland. But my problem was that if you write very long articles, nobody reads them. So I decided I shall develop a new genre. And I decided it was going to be called water cooler prose. And these would be short articles, which were hopefully a little bit funny and were presented with colourful pictures in a simple way. And I thought if I can do that well, people will talk about it. And then I will have more impact than if I write a very long, clever document. I need to be much more concise. And it worked. And certainly in the beginning, many people were actually talking about this. And I was approached by, a very large number of people who wanted to talk about this crazy blog, which was, on the one hand, clearly content driven. I mean, it was clearly about tax, and on the other hand, it didn't look like it was about tax. So I was very
Mm.
proud. But I also spent days just like of time, doing this thing. So it wasn't simple, it wasn't an easy thing to do. But I'm glad I did. And then after a couple of years, people the novelty wore off, and, it wasn't exciting anymore for them. But I simply keep doing it.
Hmm. It sounds like you were trying to have some fun with writing those blogs, but did you want to go beyond the tax audience and address the businesses or somebody else?
No, not really. I do enjoy writing. So I was enjoying having a more literary style. It was just fun to write. But the whole thing was very much pitched towards tax professionals, but obviously also in-house tax professionals. So I was writing, for example, about the code of governance in the Netherlands, which is very relevant also to in-house professionals. And I was giving my opinions about that. And I think sometimes they were also reading this and talking about it. And the really interesting thing, if you do this sort of thing, like have a very unique blog, people invite you to do podcasts or to have join conferences or be a speaker. And that for me was very important to develop my thinking, because I learn by doing things. So if I want to learn about ethics, I need to be talking about it and writing about it. That was the platform it gave me.
Mm. And we are 1 week before Christmas,
Yep.
and I saw on your blog there is a part of Christmas stories. Would you like to share a Christmas
Yeah.
story to our Text Stories blog?
Yes. Okay. There are three, and I think the second one is the best. The first one is a rewrite of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, but from a perspective of a junior tax advisor, and who has to deal with a very nasty tax partner, the Scrooge
Mm,
character. And it basically just goes through the entire Charles Dickens story, in a tax way. So I thought that was it's in Dutch, but I enjoyed writing it. My second one was a little more dramatic, and it was about good and evil. So it was a really heavy theme, and it all took place on the steps of the Dutch Supreme Court, and it's in The Hague. You can go and see it if you're here. But in front of the Supreme Court, there are four statues, Grotius is one of them, and important legal people. And my story was about the premise was that every year at Christmas, the veil between good and evil disappeared, it lifted. And every year there was a different sort of legal area where this would be relevant. It could be war and peace, for example, these really big topics. In my year, it said that it's tax. And it said it's tax because the way people deal with taxes and the way companies, but people, but also tax authorities, governments, is absolutely central to ethical behavior and the state. And it's central to democracy, it's central to society. And I believe this. It wasn't just a joke. And my story was about what happened when the worlds collided, and it became obvious who was where. So I had a procession of tax specialists, and they were recognizable if you knew what you were looking for. And they came, and there was a battle, and there were demons, and it was really dramatic. In the end, of course, the good won, so that this is a reassuring thing. Um, for me, this was the best story because I actually spent weeks thinking about it, and I actually went to the Supreme Court at night to see what it would look like and how I could describe it. So there's some dedication going in there. And the third
right.
story was about a flood. It's all quite biblical for me. It's sort of, and there was a flood, and the question is, what had been left? What would be left of our tax world after the flood? What would we still find? And I had these descriptions of like office blocks and the big four, and what would still be in there. And well, and that's that was quite detailed. And then I had the image of students and tax professors in small boats sort of going around in these small boats. And I think I actually had the IBFD building it's sort of incorporated in the whole story. So this year I haven't actually got it finished. I am actually working on something, but it's not easy.
What is it about?
I'm not quite sure yet. I'm still sort of thinking about. I mean, the trouble is that I always come up with these really big themes, and it's very difficult to top. I mean, the one with the devils on the Supreme Court is very, very difficult to top. But I like it. I mean, it's on one hand it's fun, but on the other hand, for me, it's really serious. The themes that I'm discussing.
Mm,
But I think, and I put it on LinkedIn, and people are like, what what is this? But it's yeah, so it's a unique hobby, I think.
it's great. It's great. You should keep doing this. But I bumped into a couple of prizes for you. One was in 2013 when you were still with Big Four, and one was 2020 Literature Prize. Was this because of the Christmas stories or something else?
Yeah, and see if I can get my look. This is it. They published this book for me. Can you see it?
Ah, yeah.
I have many copies because it wasn't that popular, but they published that. But it's a literature prize for tax people who are writing in a different way about tax. And I was awarded it just basically for everything. But that's the blog. But it's also I've written like 100 case comments, and I've also written some other articles and things. And the jury claimed that it was also for that work. I don't believe them. I think it was for the Christmas stories. But they were nice, and they published a whole load of my stuff in this book. So there's actually something in the library. So in 100 years, there will be something left of this
Right.
insane project. But it was really good. I was quite proud about that.
Great.
Yeah,
Congratulations. And uh, please tell us about your non-business projects. There are several of them I could find. One is affordable legal aid
yeah,
for tax matters.
yeah,
The other was Tax Knowledge Building Foundation. The you there's a independent commission for uh, reparation of childcare allowances, tax transparency
yeah.
benchmark price. So all those different activities. Would you tell us more?
Yeah, but, okay. You mentioned four, which is very dangerous because I'll probably talk the whole interview now. But I'll try and do it concisely. So the first one you mentioned was, I think, the legal aid one.
Yep.
So basically, what's happened in the Netherlands is that there is a problem in the sphere of legal aids and legal protection, and protection of rights, and in particular for poor people. And taxes are complicated, which is why we have a whole industry of tax advisors trying to help. But this is not available normally for people who don't earn very much money because they can't pay. And it's a scandal that they're not getting any kind of support about this. Luckily, there are some organisations, different legal aid things that I've been involved with some of them over the years, and these are organisations with volunteers who will do things like tax returns or appeal procedures and so on. But it's not. It really frustrates me because I think it's incredibly unfair and unjust. Because I believe that all taxpayers should have protection, not just the ones who can afford it. It's ridiculous that ones who can afford it have to pay so much money. That's a problem in itself. But I've spoken to people, and often the legal problem's not actually that difficult. The problems are things like I don't have my digital signature. They have a sort of a signature in the Netherlands. I don't know how to get one or where to request it. Therefore, I can't request a refund of tax or a tax allowance and help. What should I do? There are versions where people have accidentally been getting a refund of tax, and then it turns out they shouldn't have, and they have to repay. And if you don't have very much money, this can be a complete disaster. And so where I can, I sort of try and campaign and raise awareness about this, because it needs to change. There needs to be a structural change in this country, which will ensure that every single person has the legal protection they need. So that's sort of one thing. And my second thing, which really influenced my thought, I'm a member of a committee, the Committee of the Wise, we call ourselves, but we're an independent review committee for the childcare scandal. Do you know what that is? Will your
Yeah,
reader, will your
yeah,
you know it
I
is?
I know, but maybe our listeners don't.
Okay, so in Holland there's a system whereby people have income support via allowances, and if you have under a certain amount of income, you can request an allowance for healthcare, for rent, but also for childcare. This is important because many people in the Netherlands need childcare if they're going to go to work. So we don't have a culture that's, grandmother or sister do it. We have a culture that they need to go to the childcare facility, the daycare. And what happened was that there was, the scandal is that the tax authorities, and this is going back about 10, 15 years, wrongly accused a whole group with sort of tens of thousands of people of having received this benefit, this allowance, wrongly. And it is very well documented and also public, so I'm not saying any secrets. And these people were treated appallingly because they were considered to be frauds. They're committing frauds by the tax authorities, and that had consequences. For example, not being allowed to pay in instalments, or having their allowance stopped suddenly. And if you're depending on childcare and your allowance stops, you have to quit your job, and if you quit your job you go onto a benefit and it's less money, and it has a whole knock-on effect on people's lives. Anyway, this all came to light about 2019 to maybe a bit earlier, and since then there were various what do you call it, various studies done and politically debated and so on, but also a big operation to try and put things right. And that is almost impossible to do, because for a lot of people we're talking about something terrible that happened 10 years ago, but there's also been things like people lose their job, their debts, they lose their house, and then child come and not childcare, a child protection agency come and take the children away, because you can't look after children if you have no house. So people were seeing their children taken away. You cannot compensate this. It just can't be done. So that's a big problem. Now, my role in this is very, I have to be very humble about it. It's a small role, but we're there to double check instances where people don't get compensation, because of course there was a big operation to get it all sorted out. People were coming forward, but not every time something had gone wrong. There were some people who thought there'd been a problem and there hadn't, so this can happen. Or for example, they were looking at 10 consecutive years. They were seeing if there's a problem, and 1 year there wasn't, 9 there were. But then it comes to me to come and look at that 1 year, to have an extra sort of check. But it's a very, I have to be very humble about this. But I'm proud to help, because this is, it's another one of these things that we need to be learning from. That's why the legal aid is such a big thing. Do you have
Mhm.
any questions about this? Is it clear?
Yeah, it's clear. I wanted to ask about this legal aid. Um, uh, how was it financed?
It wasn't often, and this is the problem, is that the funding going into it, people are not given, or often not given, an amount to go and pay for a tax advisor. So what you get is volunteers helping. And this is quite possible because they're such simple problems,
Mm.
but simple problems which are very serious. And often those organisations, they might be getting funding from the municipal level or from a church or from, you know, some foundation, but they're small. They're small organisations. And what we obviously need is a much more ambitious approach to legal protection. And interestingly, at the moment, politically, that is what they're talking about. So there is a you know, a vacancy there is to have somebody at a high level in the tax authorities to take care of this. I am incredibly skeptical because what we really need is some way of having millions of people helped. You know, we don't need a facility for 2 or 3 difficult cases. We need to have a clever way of having millions of people helping each other to do these, you know, relatively simple actions, such as submitting a tax return or requesting a tax allowance. And the thing is that if somebody is poor, they normally have one of 3 things. They're going to have wage income, they're going to have benefits, or they're going to have a pension. This is not difficult to fill in a tax return. So it's, you know, you could go quite a long way if you could think of something clever to involve a bigger group.
Mm.
I obviously I have a whole plan in my head, but this is probably going a little bit off track by now. um,
Right, and about this, those childcare allowances, um, these, of course, you cannot really remunerate those situations
yeah,
where a child is taken away from their
yeah.
parent. What was the outcome of those situations? Was there additional remuneration offered
Yeah,
by the state, or how
yeah.
did it end up? Yeah.
The way that they did it was they started by saying, we're going to give people a lump sum of 30,000 euros. Now, for some people, that's fantastic. We go on holiday. For other people, that's not nearly enough. Now, when it's not enough, you can go a step further and have looking at actual damages, and they should get reimbursed for actual damages. But the problem is that that's a very you know, it's a very precise calculation. And we're looking at, you know, tens of thousands of cases potentially. I don't know how many there would be, but there's a very large number. And so at the moment, there are still people who are acknowledged as having been a victim for this, but have not yet been compensated. And I need to stress, I believe the tax authorities are doing, you know, their very, very best here. It's not because they're being, you know, not wanting to be helpful, but it's the extent of the, you know, the repair operation is just, it's huge. And of course, it's very, very sad if you have people whose children have been taken away. Well, they've already lost the best years, you know, being a family, being together. And sometimes now still they're waiting for justice. And it's incredibly frustrating. And nobody wants this. The politicians don't want it, the authorities don't want it, nobody wants that outcome. And yet there it is. So it's and this is why legal aid and legal protection is important, is that when it starts going wrong like this, you destroy lives potentially, and you cannot remedy it. And
Mm.
this is one of the reasons why preventing unjust you know, behavior up front, having justice at the beginning, is so incredibly important. So that's what
Right.
drives me in this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrible situation. And this Tax Knowledge Building Foundation, what is it about?
Okay, this is sort of a little bit of a pivot. So Tax Knowledge Foundation is about capacity building. So this is in the area of capacity building internationally, so with developing countries. And we're sort of we've been around for about a year now, but we're only just sort of starting to get up and running. But the idea is that we're going to be delivering demand-driven training as much as we possibly can in developing countries so that they become better equipped to defend their positions, to levy taxes, to negotiate, anything they need. And the idea is that because it's demand driven, we need to find the right contact points in a developing country. And maybe some of your listeners actually would be such a contact point, in which case get in contact. And the idea is that we then set up training, and we could do that hybrid or online. And with the people involved, myself, Paul Dehaan as well. Paul Dehaan was previously set up Kappa Build, which is something that may be a bit more well known for your audience, but he has a great deal of experience. And we want to pull on our network, so bring in academics, bring in practitioners, civil servants, and use our network to leverage that to get the training going, to build the capacity to put the developing countries in a better place. That's basically the idea. This
Great.
is a challenge, by the way.
Does Latvia qualify as developing country?
Does what?
Does
Latvia?
Latvia? Yeah. Does
Well,
Latvia
I
qualify?
don't know. I mean, is it a nice place to visit?
It is. It certainly is. I believe it's nicest in the world. But
I think we all believe that about our own country.
right.
But yeah, we could talk about Latvia if there's
Okay.
a reason. Yeah, we could talk about that.
Right. Just jumping back a little bit uh, about this Big Four area. Why did you leave the Big Four? It's quite often a very brave decision, and did it pay off?
Well, I actually left without a different job. I just stopped one day. And for me, the question is more, why did I join the Big Four? Because with my background, that wasn't necessarily the logical move. And the reason I joined the Big Four was because I was invited as a student by a number of professors, Tanya Bender, professor, and she's amazing. And I got to work in a really amazing team. So it's intellectually very challenging. And I joined in 2007 and I left in 2015. So my period is between the global economic crash and the BEPS deliverables, which is a nice bookending of this. And I got to do a lot of interesting stuff. I was working with state aid, a very international role. But after a certain period of time, I was finding, the Big Four environment is very commercial environment, very money oriented, very quite a hard environment in some ways. And I was just finding that I was kind of compromising sometimes on the things that I think are important. And I also sort of thought, you weigh up pros and cons. And then one day I just thought, you know what, I want to be participating in this exciting new debate after BEPS. I want to be out there, talk to the media, have my blog. And you can't do that if you're working in PwC. And I fully understand, because if you're working in a big organization and you say something, it will be attributed to that organization. And I fully understand that you can't simply go out and say that has to be structured. But for me, it became increasingly important that I could, do this. So I did. And it was a little bit of a dangerous move because I didn't have a different job. But somehow we're 10 years further and I'm still alive. So I think it paid off.
Right. It's especially financially, it's difficult to make the move when you're jumping into some sort of uncertainty.
Yes. But you know what? I don't have children, no children. I didn't have a big mortgage. I don't have a car. I don't have very much, debt, really. I don't have very much debt. So I have a lifestyle which was already quite conducive to doing that. And
Mm,
that's one of the things I teach students. I teach students now. And I always say, if you want to be independent, do not buy a big house. Don't borrow money. If you want to be independent and able to leave, just don't do this, because you
mm.
get trapped. And they always look at me like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about, but I do. And that was one of the reasons I could make the move. But if I'd had 3 children, a mortgage, a big mortgage, I had a mortgage, but a really big one, it would have been much more difficult.
Uh, you mentioned teaching. How did you end up in University of Curacao?
Ah, that's wonderful. Well, I was teaching in Rotterdam, where I was teaching, what was I doing? Dutch international tax law. So basically OECD, and sort of, I was teaching that at master level. And the professor was Professor Arnoud de Graaf, who's also quite well known because he's published quite a lot. And he said, no, sorry, I'm getting this all wrong. I started with Peter Kavelaars, who's a different professor. And he invited me to come and do one lecture in this course he had. And that sort of grew. And we're now at a point, I'm doing it with Arnoud de Graaf, and it's a 8-week course. And we integrate ethics with international tax. So what we're trying to do for the students there is to link all sorts of ethical themes. So, for example, fair share, but also stakeholders dialogue, ESG, but also a bit of philosophy, sort of that sort of themes, and then marry it into a discussion about international tax structures. And we often use BEPS 1.0 as a way to illustrate what we're talking about. And it's important because economically, Curacao is a completely different situation than the Netherlands or than Europe, in that it doesn't have a tax base that can be eroded. And they always say, well, we'd love to have some base erosion because it would mean we actually had some tax base. So for them, it's a very different type of discussion. But for me, it's very rewarding. Do you want to hear an anecdote, a rewarding
Sure,
anecdote? Sure.
go ahead.
So Curacao was for a long time on the grey list. I think it's gone off now, but it was on one of these lists of problematic jurisdictions. And I said to them at one point, "Oh, isn't it fantastic that the OECD is tackling tax havens? Because the naughty tax havens, they are bad, and so they need to be tackled." And one of the students, it was just furious. She just stared at me. And I sort of said, well, what? And she said, well, and I'm paraphrasing, but you're talking about these tax havens. What about us? We're on this list. They think that we're a tax haven. We're a small jurisdiction. We're being pressurized by big jurisdictions to change our rules when it's not actually in our favor. We don't want to do this. It's our sovereignty. I had to sort of backtrack and, sort of say, well, okay, I'm going to read more about it, and then next week we're going to revisit. And of course, I had to apologize to them because I said, yeah, I was completely biased. I was looking this only OECD perspective, and I wasn't looking at from your perspective. So, and I told them that from now on, every opportunity I would tell them this story. I would tell students, I would tell you, I would tell anybody this story as a cautionary tale. You have to
Mm.
be a little bit more careful.
But it's a good topic to stay a little while because I can see that when we had, for example, Pascal Cinnamon on the podcast, he said that basically Pillar Two is covering 95% of the worldwide profits of big multinationals. But at the same time, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I saw uh, a, an article by EPO, the European
Yeah.
Prosecutor's Office, about the next big scandal of Admiral case where hundreds of millions, if not billions, have been VAT fraud money channeled to offshore jurisdictions, and this makes me think: is it a problem of the uh, tax system, or is it a problem of tax investigators, or why those offshore jurisdictions are still uh, getting this bad publicity?
Well, I I'm going to take a step back, what's quite interesting is that's indeed the case, that the tax havens, the offshore jurisdictions, if you look at a picture about tax avoidance, there'll be an island with a palm tree. That's the sort of the universal symbol for tax haven.
Mm.
Now, if you look at what the Tax Justice Network did a couple of years ago, when they started taking a different view to what a tax haven is, and they had this thing called the Financial Secrecy Index, and they started saying, well, actually, a jurisdiction like the Netherlands or like Luxembourg or Ireland or a whole bunch of other ones, you could actually view these as tax havens as well when we start considering their place in base erosion or moving money around or secrecy. And I thought that was very interesting because do the offshore jurisdictions get a bad reputation? Well, yes, and sometimes probably fair enough. But I do think that maybe we're focusing only on those situations, and maybe not always looking enough at for example, the Netherlands as being a tax haven. Curacao and the Netherlands are interesting. They're in the kingdom of the Netherlands,
Mm.
despite being independent countries. And I always made a joke and I said, well, this is a kingdom with two tax havens in it. And one is in denial and other one is not happy. And I know that my Curacao students are always going, well, you call us a tax haven. What about your financial sector? You're a tax haven too. So I think the question of who is the tax haven is still, it's a bit more nuanced than sometimes thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought along similar lines that, for example, quite easily they could park this money somewhere in a Latvian company, for example. Maybe nobody could know about this,
Yeah.
but probably the banks would be more active in disclosing this to the investigative
Yeah.
authorities. Maybe
Yeah.
that's one of the issues
Yeah.
related to that.
But what I also think, having been, I don't know very much about Curacao. I know a little bit. And I made a point of talking to people at the Ministry of Finance, the tax authorities. So I've tried to do a little bit of homework, but I know a little bit. And what I think is that capacity issues also there are very relevant. That's where, for me, things start to come together, is that you need to have sufficient capacity at that level, at the country level, to be able to implement all sorts of international rules and to be a strong partner in the battle against tax avoidance or money laundering or whatever it is. And I think that's a facet that we could also improve upon in the capacity building sphere.
Mm. Your primary specialization now is tax ethics and tax communication. What would be typical situations when your company is hired for?
So a lot of it is, well, it's about teaching. So I'm doing trainings, I'm doing lectures, I'm doing presentations, speeches. Sometimes I've got a keynote speech coming up soon. But I do things like panels or, bouncing ideas, advocates, devil's advocate sort of stuff. So sort of, bouncing off ideas and being a sounding board. And that's the sort of stuff that I do and I get paid for to do.
Right. Um, if we stay with the ethics for a while, what is the primary source of this topic? OECD guidelines, the Constitution, the Bible, something else, and where people can start learning more about this topic?
Well, that is a question that has, multiple answers depending on who you're talking to. Now, for me, I think the big ideas are to do with society, about social contracts, but also about individual rights, human rights, legal protection, that sort of thing. It's to do with transparency, with honesty, but also simply as a taxpayer, considering, the question, I am a taxpayer, I am part of society, is what I'm doing honourable? Does it contribute adequately to this society. And people then say things like, aha, we do not know what adequate is, and woo. And the reason they say that is because they're lawyers. They're trained to be lawyers. And they say, we cannot be ethical if we do not have a harsh criterion. I think that's ridiculous. I really do. I think that in conversation between people and sitting around a table, being honest and thinking about stuff, you can actually come quite a long way to deciding what would be an ethical position, even if you don't have this harsh criterion handed down by me. I'm happy to give a harsh criterion, but I don't think it's necessary or very helpful. So that's how I see it, very much in a sort of dialogue space, and also in transparency towards the society as well. And I think it's important that the people who are making these decisions are also honest about what they're doing, because as I said earlier, in the tax environment, and I'm going to add sort of corporate environment into that for a little bit. The focus on money, bottom line, winning, power, that sort of values is very strong. But you can change it. You can start thinking about community stakeholders, sharing, transparency. You can have different values, but you need to actually start thinking about it. And the other point is that the people around you do as well. So what I've sometimes seen is that an individual in a company, so a in-house situation, will be really, really keen to have a more ethical tax structure, and it could be something like we're gonna not do fancy transfer pricing. We're just not going to do it, and it's going to cost us some money, but we're just not going to do it. And then they go to the board and they pitch this and they say this is much better, and much more in line with ESG and our professed company values. And they just get laughed at as just like, it's going to cost our shareholders money, we're not going to do it. And that's hypocrisy, because if your company says, claims to have strong ESG, strong moral values, all the nice stuff on the websites, all the pretty stuff on the website, you have to live up to it. And people aren't doing that at the moment. So you can hold them accountable for that. And that will give you something of a criterion. Just do what you said on the ESG.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned technically this lecturing or giving keynote speeches and so on. But what are the substantial topics on normally you face more than the other?
Well, next week, next month, I'm for example going for a keynote in a commercial environment, and we're going to be talking about procedural tax and ethics. And they also said, well, maybe you can take in some mediation, and start reflecting on how all of this fits into the discord that we've developed around fair share, and around stakeholder management. And also talk to us about how civil society might react to what we're doing. So I will then go away and think a lot about it. And quite often I'll also I have a couple of people I contact, and I say, well, how would you react to this? It's the simple way of seeing things. And there'll be that, and then there'll be some discussion, and there'll be people. If I, my estimate, there'll be people who are interested because they're in the room, but they'll be critical because they'll say something like, "All of the things you're saying are very pretty, but they're not practical, and I don't know how I can go back to my work and then use this, and then I'll have to come up with an answer to this." And I don't know what it would be, but that's how these discussions would go. Different topics are the tax governance code. So a group of companies were setting up a tax governance code, really impressive, because they actually got it off the ground. So it's like really, irrespective of the content of this thing, the fact that they got a big group of multinationals to actually sign it, for me, is already really quite something. But of course, the content. So we have to start talking about the content. It might say something like, we're not going to use artificial structures at all, but it's sort of implied a tax haven could be used if there was substance in it. So that then we can start talking about is well, how are you approaching this, and where do you see the boundaries? Given that these are not legal boundaries, we're not talking about legal substance, you're talking about moral substance. So what is that for you? And then you can have a very interesting conversation.
Right. And who do you think who is now prevailing? Is the situation changing that the good is winning over bad? I mean, we every day we face situations regarding, I don't know, exports to Russia, for
Yeah,
example, for legal advice to those who are exporting to Russia, for drawing the line, where is the line of economic substance of a
yeah.
holding company, things like that. Do you see companies are improving in their ethical behavior now?
Well, it's very I recently told a group of students that my view is like it goes up and down. And on a good day, I would say to you, it's going really well. And on a bad day, I'd say this is terrible. And it would be heavily influenced by whatever I'd read in the newspaper in the morning. So that already shows that it's at least in my mind, it's not settled. On the one hand, I think it's very good. It is going the right direction. I think that there is more focus generally on the social implications of tax, governance aspects. The fact that I'm able to make a living talking about ethics, that's quite something. Well, certainly to me. But that says something. But on the other hand, you're right. I mean, there are many companies and tax professionals who simply say, well, it's all nice, but at the end of the day, my job is to apply the law. I'm getting paid to provide the law. And I do get that. And if I can make a step backwards again, we were talking about legal aid, for example, to poor people. If you're giving legal aid to poor people, I would be as aggressive as I possibly could be. I would do anything to get these people more money. Well, not anything, but I'd be, legally. But I
Yeah.
would, my entire focus would be, how do I get this person optimal outcome? And then when it becomes a big company, I suddenly start to change my view, and it suddenly becomes, well, actually, this is a big company, so they should be more social. But that's already sort of suggests that it's not black or white. It's not a question of is something ethical or is it unethical. It's context related. So when my sort of world is going like that, when I'm happy and sad, and I sort of it's context. And so a long answer, which is kind of going in circles here. But ultimately, is it going in the right direction? Yes, it probably is. But we've got to be very careful not to take a step back. So we should keep going in the right direction. And we could also be a bit more ambitious and try and go a bit faster.
Right, right. And to go faster, you have written a blog about tax governance code, and I saw that many companies have, at least in the Netherlands, have signed it. Uh, what's in the code, and why this could be a good practice for companies?
Well, the code kind of sets out, it's basically promises for a certain ethical behavior. And it's things like we promise to be transparent and to have a good relationship with the tax authorities in different countries, for example. That's already quite something that you say we're going to try and have a positive relationship. It's about substance. It's about we're not going to paraphrasing here, but we're not going to do aggressive tax planning. We're going to and so there's a whole I think it's about six of these, maybe seven sort of pledges that they're basically making. And there has been criticism because people were saying, well, that's nice, but there's no substance here. You're just saying, I mean, you're going to be transparent. Well, you already needed to be transparent because you have reporting obligation. So what's that? I think it is significant because it represents again a step by companies to publicly declare that they want to meet these criteria and to sort of publicly say, we believe we should have this high standard. And it's also inviting other people, me or Tax Justice Network or anybody, to come and hold them to it. So Tax Justice could say, well, hang on, company, you promised that you were going to have a positive relationship with the tax authorities, but you're not. What's that about? So they're setting a bar. So I think that's important. Let me know
Yeah.
if this is all becoming very, very sort of confusing, and I talk quite fast. So
No. It's perfect actually, and I see it's very relevant. Also, if we if we judge by what, for example, Pascal Senman is doing, that he basically also moved to tax communication area after managing OECD tax policy issues. So this is all very
yeah, I'm not.
relevant to me.
I'm pre I'm pretty sure that I have a different take than Pascal Saint-Amand, though. I think.
In what sense?
Well, I think I don't know. In some ways I'm quite radical. In some ways, because I take quite a sort of fundamental view to things. And if I become convinced that this tax governance code is nonsense, I will say this at a certain point. And I don't know Pascal Saint-Amand, so I'm not going to say what he would do. But I think one of the things that makes me unique in this debate is that I am extremely independent. And financially, organization wise, I am extremely independent. And that has, for me personally, quite big disadvantages sometimes.
Mm.
But it makes me maybe a little bit different from someone like him. Quite aside from the fact that he was one of the most important people in the tax world for years and years and years, with massive amount of experience and a fantastic network, etc. I am none of these things. So therein lies another difference.
And but considering your area of specialization on tax ethics, how do you see the future of tax systems, like ideally and realistically? What needs to be done, and probably what will be done?
Okay, countries and populations, people need to be empowered much more when it comes to the tax system, all aspects. So right from the little guy, the allowances, right up to Pillar Two, just the whole range. Now, tax authorities, in particular in developing countries, but maybe also elsewhere, but developing countries need capacity, desperately need the capacity to be able to defend the interest of their own country. It's that simple. When it comes to the inclusive framework or the UN, wherever, countries need to walk in confident that they know what they're doing, they're up to date. And this is an ethical question for me. So that's one thing. The future, it should be empowerment. And I don't I obviously the one of the big questions is this UN convention, and where is that going to go? I'm still a little bit skeptical about this thing, because I don't I there are many steps that still need to be taken for such a thing to be well, exist properly or function or be a good idea. But doesn't it show us something though? Doesn't it show about the emancipation in a way that countries who were excluded from BEPS 1.0, they were included in the inclusive framework. People have turned their back on that and said this ain't good enough. So that for me is positive, but I'm a little bit I need to wait and see to what actually comes out of that. But on the other hand, it's a long game. So even if the current discussion on this treaty, it comes to nothing or it's not good enough, who knows, 10 years, 20 years, we're playing a long game here. Ultimately, I think that, when people have the capacity and they're empowered and they have access to what they need to have, I think that will make a much stronger system, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Right. And you've mentioned several times Tax Justice Network and activism journalists. Uh, uh, why governments don't hear them, or they don't want to hear them?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. On the one hand, I would challenge what you said, because governments do hear them. So, for example, when we're talking about the big numbers, what was it, 300 trillion pounds had been lost, something like these really big numbers. These numbers are taken into the media, the journalists, and sometimes taken into the political debate. That's true. Historically, country by country reporting was developed very closely with the Tax Justice Network and the OECD. That was Richard Murphy, but this is 20 years ago. But historically, they've had a massive amount of influence, so that's a good thing. But I think what we're seeing now, as an outsider looking at it, is that the activist sort of side is coming up very strongly, and they're very much pushing towards the UN solution, which I very much understand, because ultimately this organization is looking out for developing countries. That's one of the big things that they're interested in, and where their mission lies is developing countries, and they see this as an opportunity. But of course, that debate about pushing for the UN is much less about domestic policy. In the Netherlands, for example. So the Netherlands obviously has a position on the UN, but I think it's a slightly different sort of topic that they're highlighting compared to country by country reporting 20 years ago. But I'm not. I mean, I think that ultimately they do and have had a lot of influence. I mean, not because they no longer because they determine the policy, but because they determine the context. So the whole context of we were talking about these political discussions, my ups and downs, which are entirely context driven. It's Tax Justice Network and other organisations, similar organisations, who are setting that agenda, have been setting that agenda, which is one of the reasons that business doesn't like them very much, and one of the reasons. But yeah, so I think, but I think that in 10 years' time they will still be here, still have a role to play.
Right. And my last question on the tax ethics topic, what's your take on the future of holding companies? Where do you see the line will be drawn? You're based in Netherlands, and that has been for many years typical holding jurisdiction.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
what's your vision for the future?
that is very interesting. So from an ethical sort of standpoint, the problem with holding companies is that people are not able to defend these things. I cannot explain to my parents, or my sister, who's clever, but I cannot explain why holding companies are necessary, are a good idea. Now, sometimes, if I can explain this, if there is a good reason, for example, we needed an access to Europe and we're in 3 different member states and we wanted a central point, or something like that, that I can explain, and then there is no problem. Then it's a non-issue. But if these things don't have any other function than tax, that which are the problematic ones, I think, and they're indefensible. Well, basically, they're just going to get on. They're just going to get attacked and attacked and attacked, until one day people give up and they say, forget the Netherlands, we're going to go somewhere else. Because tax avoidance isn't going to stop, tax structuring won't stop. They'll just go somewhere else. But if for example, people who want to have these holding companies, or people in the sort of the trust sector, they need to be able to explain and defend what they're doing in a more convincing way publicly. And if they can't do that, then that's it. There's no going back. And that is where tax communication becomes important. You have the ethics, but you need to be able to explain it.
Right. And the very last question of our podcast is more to all of my guests on the same philosophical note. What's your version of meaning of life? So why do we do everything that we do?
Um, why do I? I'll answer it for myself. But this is all going to sound incredibly pretentious. But I actually want to be a good person. I want to be proud of what I'm doing. I want to be able to, be independent, to care about the world. So that for me are the values which give life meaning. And for other people, it's clearly different. Other people clearly have different priorities, which is fine. It's up to them. But I actually think that it is, I realized this sort of somewhere in my career. I suddenly realized what I do on a day-to-day basis, what I do for my work, is not a compartmentalized thing. It's actually the main thing that I do, other than having, being in a family, but it's the main thing I do in society. So I have to make sure that this is contributing in a way which is in line with what I believe, which is bringing people together, improving people, looking after people who are weaker, poor people. So that's is this an answer? It's another.
That's a
It's as good
perfect
as it's
answer.
gonna get.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Anna Gunn, those who want to visit, who want to learn more about Anna and her work, visit Anna Gunn. Uh, uh, was it guntax.com, right?
Yeah, that's it. Anna at guntax.com.
Yeah,
And the website is article, but with a K, Dutch 104.nl.
perfect. So thank you. Thank you for your time and for your wisdom. Thank you, Anna.
Okay. All right.